Your body wouldn't shut down all at once. It'd betray you piece by piece. Fingers stiff, breath shallow, eyes frozen open by morning. A medieval winter storm didn't need weeks to kill you, just one day. But what exactly turned 24 hours into a death sentence for so many, even inside their own homes? It starts the moment you try to rest. Your medieval bed was basically a pile of rough wool blankets and animal skins thrown over a straw mattress. Medieval mattresses had all the comfort of sleeping on a pile of angry cats. No heating systems existed. Wind howled through cracks in the walls like invisible knives cutting through your home. Medieval homes had zero insulation. Gaps between stones let in snow and freezing air. Your house keeps cold better than a modern refrigerator keeps food fresh. Dirt floors froze solid, turning the ground under your feet into sheets of ice. Hearth fires provided heat in maybe a 3-foot radius around the flames. Step back 4 feet and you might as well be standing outside in the blizzard. Your breath formed clouds indoors, just like it did outside. Medieval central heating was basically a campfire with commitment issues. People wore every piece of clothing they owned to bed. Entire families would huddle together under whatever covering they could find. Some brought livestock into their sleeping areas for extra body heat. Sharing a bed with a goat suddenly seemed like luxury accommodation. Hypothermia crept in during sleep without any warning signs. Many people simply never woke up the next morning. Their families would discover frozen corpses when dawn broke. Morning brought new dangers that made bedtime cold seem comfortable. Starting a fire from scratch became a life or death challenge every single morning. No matches, no lighters, no easy ignition existed. You had to strike flint against steel in total darkness while your hands were completely numb from the cold. Lighting fires with frozen hands was like trying to perform surgery while wearing oven mitts. Every water source froze overnight into solid blocks of ice. Wells became unusable chunks of frozen water. You needed to break through thick ice with metal tools just to get drinking water. Breaking ice with frozen hands was like trying to play piano while wearing boxing gloves. Livestock care couldn't be skipped no matter how brutal the weather became. Cows needed milking even in sub-zero temperatures. Chickens required fresh food and water. Medieval farming was basically running an outdoor restaurant for animals who never paid their bills. Going outside meant facing winds that could knock you down and snow that buried landmarks. Getting lost between your house and barn meant freezing to death just yards from safety. People tied ropes between buildings to avoid getting lost in their own yards during blizzards. Ice made every surface a potential death trap. Slip and fall while carrying water buckets, and you'd soak yourself in freezing temperatures. Cut yourself with an axe or knife while your hands were numb, and you might not notice until you'd lost dangerous amounts of blood. Every task carried risk of injury, hypothermia, or death. But avoiding chores meant certain starvation, so you had to choose between probable death and guaranteed death. What you wore outside made those deadly choices even worse. Medieval winter clothing consisted mainly of rough wool and linen garments that offered about as much protection as wearing a thick towel. Medieval fashion designers apparently thought hypothermia was a trendy look. Most people owned just one complete outfit. No spare clothes, no layering systems, no specialized winter gear existed for common folk. Shoes were thin pieces of leather or cloth wrapped around feet. No rubber, no insulation, no waterproofing whatsoever. Medieval footwear was basically leather bags tied to your ankles. Once wet, they stayed soaked for days or weeks. Wet feet in freezing air guaranteed frostbite and infection. Gloves were expensive luxury items that most families couldn't afford. Bare hands had to grip frozen metal tools, handle icy water, and work with rough wood. Fingers would crack open from cold and bleed from the constant exposure. Try chopping firewood when you can't bend your fingers. Cloaks provided the illusion of warmth, but failed completely against driving wind and snow. They were basically large pieces of cloth that flapped around uselessly. Wearing a medieval cloak in a blizzard was like using a bedsheet as an umbrella. Getting clothes wet meant wearing them wet until they dried on your body. This process could take several days in winter humidity. Damp clothing against skin and freezing temperatures created perfect conditions for pneumonia and other respiratory illnesses that killed quickly. Changing outfits wasn't possible when you only owned one set of everything. Tear your cloak or damage your shoes, and you have to make repairs or go without. Many people walked around in clothes that were more whole than fabric by late winter. Even worse than inadequate clothing was what you had to fuel your body. Medieval winter food storage relied on salted meat that became harder than wooden blocks, dried peas that had been sitting since harvest, and bread so stale it could be used as construction material. Medieval winter meals had the nutritional variety of eating the same cardboard box every day. Fresh anything simply didn't exist for months at a time. Vegetables disappeared completely from diets. Fruits were forgotten luxuries. Milk came only if your animal survived and produced in freezing conditions. Scurvy, rickets, and night blindness became common from vitamin deficiencies. Salt was the main preservation method, but it made food nearly inedible. Meat became so salty and tough that people had to soak it for hours before cooking. Medieval preserved meat was basically edible shoe leather with a salt coating. Too much salt also made people desperately thirsty, but clean water was hard to find. Spoiled food became acceptable food when starvation threatened. Moldy bread, rancid meat, and fermented whatever filled empty stomachs. Food poisoning was preferable to death by hunger. People ate it anyway because throwing away food meant death. Storage containers were basic wooden barrels and cloth sacks that didn't keep moisture or pests out effectively. Grain would develop mold or become infested with insects. Medieval food storage was like keeping snacks in a house party where all the guests were rats and bugs. By late winter, families survived on thin broths made from bones and scraps, sometimes just hot water with a tiny bit of salt for flavor. Children cried constantly from hunger pains, while adults grew weak and dizzy from malnutrition. Protecting whatever food you had became a matter of life and death. Medieval home security consisted of wooden doors held together with rope and maybe some metal strips. Most houses had no locks at all. Windows were just openings in walls covered with cloth or thin wood. Medieval home protection was like trying to secure a fort made of matchsticks. Desperate neighbors turned into dangerous enemies when food ran out. Friendly families who shared meals in summer would break into each other's homes during winter storms. Medieval winter turned neighborhood watch groups into neighborhood theft groups. The sound of wind and snow covered the noise of forced entry perfectly. Bandits roamed the frozen countryside, looking for isolated farms and villages. These weren't noble outlaws from stories. They were starving, violent people who'd murder entire families for a bag of grain. Winter storms provided perfect cover for raids because victims couldn't escape and help couldn't arrive. Firewood theft was incredibly common because people couldn't survive without fuel for heat. Chopping and splitting wood required enormous effort, so stealing it was easier than making it. Stealing someone's firewood was basically stealing their life one log at a time. Livestock raids could destroy a family's survival chances completely. Cattle provided milk, meat, and work power. Lose your animals, and you lost food production, transportation, and field labor all at once. Raiders would drive off entire herds during blizzards when tracking was impossible. Justice meant violence because no police or legal system functioned during winter emergencies. People had to defend their property with weapons or lose everything they needed to survive. Even families who managed to keep their food and firewood safe faced another deadly enemy. Medieval medicine was basically wild guessing combined with dangerous superstitions. Medieval doctors had about as much medical knowledge as a fortune teller with a scalpel. Pneumonia spread through cold, damp houses faster than gossip in a small village. Respiratory infections killed whole families within weeks because nobody understood germs or proper treatment. Bloodletting was considered advanced medical care. Doctors would cut sick people to drain supposed bad blood, which actually made patients weaker and more likely to die. Medieval medical treatment was often more dangerous than the original illness. Herbal remedies ranged from completely useless to actively harmful. People believed that bad smells caused disease, so they'd fill rooms with strong-smelling herbs instead of addressing real problems like poor ventilation and contaminated water. Medieval air fresheners were basically the entire healthcare system. Broken bones never healed properly because medieval doctors had no understanding of proper bone setting. Simple fractures became permanent disabilities. Infected cuts turned into life-threatening blood poisoning within days. Dental problems caused face infections that spread to the brain. Mental illness was blamed on evil spirits or divine punishment. People suffering from what we now recognize as depression, anxiety, or trauma were often abandoned by their communities. Fever was essentially a death sentence. Without understanding infection or having antibiotics, even minor illnesses could become fatal. Children and elderly people died first, but healthy adults followed quickly when their immune systems collapsed from stress and malnutrition. But disease wasn't the only thing that could kill you while you slept. Medieval roofs were made from thatch, which was basically straw and mud piled up and hoped to stay put. Medieval roofing was like trusting a pile of grass to keep you dry. Snow loads would accumulate until the weight became too much for wooden support beams to handle. When roofs collapsed, they buried everything underneath, including people. Ice formation created devastating structural damage. Water would seep into cracks and freeze, expanding with enough force to split thick wooden beams like twigs. Medieval houses were basically being slowly torn apart by ice from the inside out. Frozen water leaks turned homes into soggy, moldy disaster zones. Everything inside became damp and stayed damp for months. Wood beams splitting from extreme cold weakened every joint and connection in the house. Fire presented an impossible choice between freezing and burning to death. Crude chimneys often leaked sparks onto thatched roofs. Medieval heating systems were basically controlled disasters waiting to become uncontrolled disasters. Many families burned alive trying to stay warm. Repairs during winter storms were nearly impossible. One bad storm could damage your shelter beyond your ability to fix it, leaving you completely exposed. But sometimes the threats came from the outside. Winter drove starving wolves closer to human settlements in search of easy food sources. These predators would circle houses at night, drawn by the smell of stored meat and the warmth of fires. Medieval pest control for wolves involved hoping they'd get bored and leave. Medieval doors and walls offered little protection against determined hungry animals. Bears occasionally wandered into villages when their normal food sources disappeared under snow. Rodent infestations destroyed food supplies and spread deadly diseases like plague and typhus. Medieval bear encounters were like having a furry bulldozer attack your house. Desperate travelers would force entry into homes during storms looking for shelter and food. These weren't polite visitors asking for help. They were half-frozen, starving people willing to kill families and take over their homes rather than die in the cold. Starvation turned ordinary neighbors into violent threats. Peaceful farmers became raiders when their children started dying from hunger. Medieval winter transformed friendly villages into collections of potential enemies. Nighttime brought terror because houses had no lighting except flickering fires. Total darkness outside meant you couldn't see threats approaching until they were already at your door. The combination of cold, hunger, disease, structural failure, and constant threats created a perfect storm of medieval misery that modern people simply couldn't survive.